The Galactic Council chamber was filled with voices from 47 different species as they gathered for their quarterly meeting. Ambassador Daniel Wright led the human delegation into the room, and they took their seats in the modest section assigned to Earth. The humans had been part of the Council for 12 years now, since first contact with the Valorian trade fleet had brought them into the galactic community. During those 12 years, humanity had worked hard to prove they belonged among the stars. They shared their art and music and scientific discoveries with anyone who wanted to learn. They had been committed to peaceful cooperation with all species, and had never once broken their word or failed to meet their obligations. The meeting that day was supposed to focus on resource allocation for the Joint Defense Initiative that protected Council space from external threats. Humans had contributed more than their fair share to this program by offering both military personnel and advanced technology that had proven invaluable during recent fights with pirate factions along the border regions. Daniel felt proud of what his species had accomplished in such a short time, compared to civilizations that had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. High Counselor Thexmar of the Valorian Ascendancy called the session to order. His body was made of living crystal that bent the light in the chamber into rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice carried a musical quality that was typical of his species and commanded immediate attention from everyone present. He announced that there was one final matter to address before they concluded the session, and Daniel felt a small twist of concern in his stomach because this topic was not listed on the official agenda. Counselor Veshkir rose from his seat, and his reptilian features showed what might have been satisfaction or perhaps anticipation. He represented the Saurian collective, and his scales glittered under the chamber lights as he began to speak. He explained that the collective had prepared a comprehensive review of humanity's contributions to the Council over the past decade, and that it was time for an honest assessment of Earth's place in the galactic community. What followed made Daniel's blood run cold. Every achievement that humanity had worked so hard to accomplish was systematically torn apart and dismissed. The medical advances that had saved thousands of lives across multiple species were called primitive tinkering by doctors who barely understood biology. The diplomatic efforts that had resolved 3 separate conflicts without violence were labeled as emotional manipulation by a species too unstable to think rationally. The military contributions that had protected Council borders were dismissed as barbaric violence that was barely contained by human commanders. Even their art and culture, which had been celebrated in exhibitions across Council space, were now mocked as the crude scratchings of children who were playing at civilization. Counselor Zeph joined the attack, and her body of pure energy floated above her station as she spoke. She represented the Luminar Concordat, and her voice echoed through the chamber with cutting precision. She stated that humanity's very presence degraded the dignity of the Council itself. She called humans a warlike species that had barely evolved past their tribal stage of development. She pointed out that Earth still struggled with internal conflicts and resource management issues that more advanced civilizations had solved millennia ago. Her conclusion was clear and brutal in its simplicity. Humanity was not ready for the galactic stage and perhaps never would be. Daniel stood up quickly and tried to keep his face neutral, even though anger was burning in his chest like a furnace. He began to speak and tried to remind Counselor Zeph that humanity had contributed significant resources and personnel to Council operations, but she cut him off. Before he could finish his sentence, Thexmar's voice rang out sharp and commanding as he told Daniel to be silent. The High Counselor stated that the Council had heard enough from the human species over the years, and that the time for listening to Earth's excuses had ended. He called for an immediate vote on Resolution 749, which would expel humanity from the Galactic Council and terminate all cooperative treaties and agreements between Earth and the Council members. The vote happened so quickly that Daniel barely had time to process what was occurring. The numbers appeared on the display screens throughout the chamber, and they told a devastating story. 43 species voted in favor of expelling humanity. 3 species abstained from voting. Only 1 species voted against the resolution, and that was the Kalari Union, whose representative was Ambassador Kira. Kira stood at her station, and her silver fur seemed to dim as she shook her head sadly. She was a feline-featured humanoid whose people had always been fair and honorable in their dealings with Earth. She, spoke quietly, but her words carried weight as she told the council that this was a mistake they would come to regret. Her warning was lost in the self-satisfied murmuring of the other delegates who seemed pleased with themselves for putting the upstart humans in their place. Daniel began to gather his papers from his station with slow and deliberate movements. His deputy, Lisa Morgan, and the rest of the human delegation followed his example, and their actions were precise and controlled. There were no outbursts of anger or protests against the injustice. There were no tears or pleas for reconsideration. The humans simply began to pack their belongings, as if they were leaving any normal meeting. As the human delegation walked toward the exit of the chamber, Counselor Veshikir called out to them with mockery dripping from every word. He told them to run home to their little blue world and play their games of war and politics there, where they could not harm real civilizations. Several other delegates laughed at this comment, and the sound echoed through the chamber like the jeering of a crowd at an execution. Daniel paused at the doorway, and for a long moment it seemed like he might turn around and say something. The entire chamber fell silent as they waited to see if the human ambassador would deliver some final angry speech or desperate plea. Instead, Daniel simply straightened his jacket and adjusted his collar. He nodded once to Ambassador Kira in a gesture of respect and gratitude for her lone vote in humanity's favor. Then he walked out of the chamber without saying a single word. The human delegation left Council Station Harmony that same day, and their departure was as efficient and thorough as everything else they did. Within 72 hours, every human diplomat and scientist, and engineer and military advisor in Council Space had boarded their ships and begun the journey home to Earth. They did not leave in anger or haste, but rather with calm, determination, and careful planning. The humans took everything with them. Every piece of human technology was removed or destroyed. Every shared database was wiped clean of human contributions. Every joint research project was terminated, and all human data was deleted from Council systems. The terminals that humans had used were cleaned and reset to factory settings. The quarters they had occupied were left spotless and empty, as if no one had ever lived there. The human embassy on Council Station Harmony stood vacant with its doors sealed and its systems powered down. Not a single human sent a message of protest to the Council. Not one filed a formal complaint through the official channels. Not one appeared on galactic news networks to plead their case to the public. They simply left as completely and thoroughly as if they had never been part of the galactic community at all. The Council delegates congratulated themselves on handling the situation firmly and decisively. They told each other that they had made the right choice, and that humanity would either mature and petition for readmission under stricter terms, or they would fade into obscurity on their isolated little planet. After all, what could one young species possibly do to threaten the established order of galactic civilization that had stood for 3,000 years? Ambassador Kira returned to her quarters after the vote and sat alone in the dark. She had tried to warn them, but they would not listen. She knew humans better than most Council species because the Kalari had worked closely with Earth on several projects over the years. She knew that humans did not forget insults easily, and that they had a stubborn pride that ran deeper than most species understood. The Council had not just rejected humanity today. They had humiliated them in front of the entire galaxy and dismissed everything they had worked so hard to achieve. Kira opened a private communication channel to her government on the Kalari homeworld. She recommended that they maintain friendly relations with Earth, regardless of the Council's decision. Her superiors agreed and authorized her to send a private message to Daniel, expressing the Kalari Union's continued respect and friendship for humanity. The message was sent, but no reply came back. Earth had gone silent. 3 months passed after humanity's expulsion, and the Council began to notice that something was wrong. It started with small things that seemed insignificant at first but gradually became more concerning as the weeks went by. A Valorian research station that was studying dark matter fluctuations sent an urgent request for the human physicist who had been consulting on their project for the past 2 years. The reply came back from Earth within a day, and it was brief and formal. Dr. Gregory Palmer had retired from all interstellar consultation work and would not be available for any further projects with non-human species. The Valorian scientists were confused by this response because Dr. Palmer was only 43 years old and at the peak of his career. They sent another message asking if they could speak with him directly to discuss the matter, but this message received no response at all. The dark matter research project stalled without his expertise because the calculations he had been working on were too complex for the Valorian team to complete on their own. A Luminar medical facility that specialized in treating rare diseases discovered that their human medical liaison had also departed. Dr. Claire Hudson had been helping them develop treatment protocols for a crystalline degradation syndrome that affected energy-based species like the Luminar. The protocols were only half complete when she left, and she had taken all of her research notes back to Earth as part of humanity's intellectual property. The Luminar doctors tried to continue the work without her, but they quickly realized that her approach to the problem had been completely different from their own methods, and they could not replicate her results. The Saurian collective faced a more immediate problem with their flagship vessel. The Dominion's Pride was one of their most advanced warships, and it had been equipped with an enhanced sensor array that was designed by human engineers 3 years earlier. The system began to malfunction during a routine patrol, and when the Saurian technicians tried to access the maintenance protocols, they found that all the files were encrypted with human-specific algorithms that they could not break. They sent urgent messages to Earth, requesting technical assistance and offering to pay whatever price the humans demanded for the information. Captain Ralseth stood on the bridge of the Dominion's Pride and stared at the blank communication screen with growing frustration. He ordered his first officer to review the original contract for the sensor array to see if there was any way to legally compel the humans to provide support. The first officer spent hours going through the documents before reporting back with bad news. The Saurians owned the physical hardware and the basic specifications, but the detailed implementation protocols and maintenance procedures were listed as proprietary, human technology that had been licensed for use, but not owned by the collective. The license had automatically terminated when the treaty between Earth and the Council was dissolved. More messages were sent to Earth from species all across Council space. Research facilities needed human scientists. Medical centers needed human doctors. Military installations needed human engineers. Trading companies needed human negotiators. Educational institutions needed human teachers. All of these messages were acknowledged by Earth's automated systems, but none of them received actual responses from real people. The Kalari Union had voted against humanity's expulsion, and Ambassador Kira hoped that this would mean Earth would at least maintain relations with her people. She sent a personal message to Daniel asking if they could meet to discuss continued cooperation between their two species. The reply came back within a week, and it was polite but absolutely firm. Earth appreciated the Kalari Union's past support, but humanity was currently focusing on internal development and would not be engaging in any external consultation or cooperation at this time. The message made it clear that this policy applied to all non-human species without exception, including those who had supported Earth in the Shi Council vote. Kira read the message 3 times, looking for any hint of warmth or friendship in the formal language, but she found nothing except cold, professional courtesy. The humans had not just withdrawn from the Council, they had withdrawn from the entire galactic community, and they were not interested in maintaining even friendly relationships with individual species. High Counselor Thexmar convened an emergency session of the Council when the reports of humanity's complete silence began to accumulate. He stood before the assembled delegates, and his crystalline body pulsed with visible agitation as he spoke. He declared that humanity's behavior was unacceptable and that they had obligations to fulfill. He argued that they could not simply withdraw all cooperation and refuse all contact with species they had worked with for over a decade. Counselor Zeph floated in the center of the chamber, and her energy form was dimmer than usual, as if she was troubled by something. She had reviewed all of the treaties and contracts between Earth and the various Council species, and her findings were not encouraging. She reported that humanity had violated none of their legal obligations. They had fulfilled every contract before departing. They had returned all Council property that was in their possession, or destroyed it according to proper protocols. Their complete withdrawal from galactic affairs was unexpected and unprecedented, but it was entirely legal under Council law. Counselor Veshkir slammed his clawed hand on his station, and his scales flushed dark with anger. He called humanity's behavior childish and said they were sulking like younglings, who had been disciplined by their parents. He insisted that this proved the council had been right to expel them, because they were clearly not mature enough to handle galactic politics. Several other delegates murmured in agreement and seemed relieved to have this explanation for humanity's actions, but as the weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that this was not a temporary tantrum. This was a permanent policy decision that had been carefully planned and thoroughly implemented. Earth's communications network continued to receive thousands of messages from across council space every day. There were pleas for help and offers of enormous payments and diplomatic overtures promising favorable trade terms. Every single message was acknowledged by the same automated response that stated humanity was not currently accepting consultation requests from Galactic Council species and that this was a permanent policy decision. The human ships that had once traveled freely through council space and had been a common sight at trading stations and research outposts simply vanished. The trade routes that human merchants had opened and maintained for years fell into disuse as no one else bothered to service the smaller colonies and outposts that had relied on human commerce. The patrol routes that human military vessels had volunteered to cover went unmanned and left gaps in the Council's defensive network that would later prove catastrophic. The Valorian Ascendancy lost contact with 3 of their frontier colonies when the early warning sensor network failed. The network had been a joint project between Valorian and human engineers, with the humans maintaining the crucial quantum entanglement communicators that allowed instant communication across vast distances. Without human technical expertise, the system began to degrade rapidly, and within 2 months it had failed completely in several sectors. When raiders attacked those 3 unprotected colonies, the Valorian response fleet arrived almost 6 hours too late to prevent massive casualties. The Valorians had relied on the early warning system to detect threats and deploy their forces quickly, but without it, their reaction time had more than tripled. Thousands of Valorian civilians died in those raids, and the military command was forced to explain to their government how they had allowed such a disaster to occur. Similar incidents began happening across council space with increasing frequency. Critical systems failed because human maintenance personnel were no longer available. Research projects ground to a halt because human scientists had taken their expertise home. Trade networks collapsed because human merchants had been the intermediaries connecting species that would not deal directly with each other. Medical treatments became unavailable because human doctors had developed the protocols and had not left complete documentation behind. The carefully balanced infrastructure of galactic civilization, which had seemed so robust and permanent, began to show cracks. The Council had not realized how deeply humanity had woven itself into the fabric of their society over just 12 years. The humans had not been the largest contributors or the wealthiest partners, but they had been everywhere doing the small, essential tasks that kept everything running smoothly. In the council chamber, the delegates who had so confidently voted to expel humanity began to feel doubt creeping into their minds. Councillor Veshikir still insisted loudly that the humans would eventually come back when their economy collapsed without galactic trade. He predicted that within 6 months, Earth would be begging for readmission to the Council and would accept whatever terms were offered to them. But intelligence reports from Earth told a different story. Humanity's economy had not collapsed. In fact, it appeared to be growing stronger than ever. 6 months after humanity's departure from the Council, the Valorian Ascendancy faced a crisis that threatened their entire civilization. The Kethtar swarm was a nomadic insectoid species that periodically raided the outer regions of galactic space, and they had just launched their largest offensive in over a century. 17 Valorian colonies came under simultaneous attack, and the defensive forces were caught completely unprepared for the scale and coordination of the assault. High Admiral Korath commanded the Valorian defense fleet from the bridge of his flagship Celestial Dawn, and he watched the tactical displays with growing horror as reports flooded in from every sector. The Kethtar had completely changed their approach to warfare, and instead of the predictable wave assaults that the Valorians had defended against for generations, they were now using sophisticated hit-and-run tactics that targeted supply lines and communication hubs with devastating precision. A junior tactical officer noticed something disturbing about the enemy patterns and reported to the admiral that the Kethtar tactics looked very similar to human military doctrine. The strategies emphasized small unit coordination and precision, strikes and psychological warfare designed to disrupt enemy morale and decision-making. Admiral Korath asked if the officer was suggesting that humans were helping the Kethtar, but the young officer quickly explained that was not what he meant at all. The tactical officer pulled up archived records from joint military exercises that the Council had conducted with human forces during their 12 years of membership. He showed how the Kethtar were using variations of the same tactics that human commanders had demonstrated during those exercises. The intelligence about human military methods had been shared freely throughout the Council because everyone assumed that primitive human tactics would not be valuable to advanced civilizations. Now those same tactics were being used against them with terrible effectiveness. The Valorian fleet had been designed specifically to counter traditional Kethtar swarm tactics, with massive ships that had powerful shields capable of withstanding waves of enemy attackers. Against precision strikes aimed at weak points and command centers, these enormous vessels proved to be slow and vulnerable. The humans had actually pointed out this exact vulnerability during their time on the Council and had offered to share their rapid response protocols and small craft carrier designs, but the Valorians had politely declined the offer because they considered such approaches beneath their advanced civilization. 3 Valorian colonies fell completely within the first week of fighting, and 5 more were under siege with their populations trapped and facing starvation. Admiral Korath was forced to request emergency assistance from the Council, but the response was slow and inadequate, because every species was now worried about their own defensive vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the Luminar Concordat was dealing with their own disaster that threatened millions of lives across their territory. A cascading failure in their quantum power grid had started in one system and was spreading rapidly through the network that supplied energy to 47 star systems. The Luminar engineers worked frantically to stop the cascade, but they could not identify the root cause of the failure. The grid had experienced similar problems 5 years earlier, but it had been stabilized by a human engineer named Nathan Cross, who spent 3 months analyzing the quantum matrices and identifying a critical oscillation flaw that no one else had noticed. Nathan had corrected the problem using mathematical approaches that the Luminar had considered inelegant and unnecessarily complex, but his solution had worked perfectly, and the grid had been stable ever since. Now the same problem had returned, but Nathan was gone and the Luminar engineers could not replicate his work. They tried to recreate his calculations, but the human approach to quantum mechanics was fundamentally different from their own methods, and they could not bridge the gap in understanding. Without Nathan's expertise, the cascade continued to spread, and entire star systems began experiencing power failures that threatened life support systems and planetary infrastructure. Counselor Zeph personally led a delegation to the edge of human space in a desperate attempt to request emergency assistance. Her ship transmitted a priority message explaining the crisis and emphasizing that millions of innocent lives were at stake. The automated response came back within seconds, and it was the same message that every other species had received. Humanity was not currently accepting consultation requests from Galactic Council species, and this was a permanent policy decision. Zeph tried to override the automated system by explaining that this was not a routine consultation, but a genuine emergency situation. The response was identical word for word. She then tried offering substantial compensation and stated that the Luminar Concordat was prepared to pay any price that humanity demanded for Nathan's help. There was a long pause before the next response came, and for a moment Zeph felt hope rising in her energy form. The response was exactly the same automated message with no variation or acknowledgement of her offer. The human system was not even registering their emergency as worthy of human attention. Zeph's ship turned back toward Luminar space, and behind them, the Concordat began emergency evacuations of the affected systems, knowing that millions would not survive the process. The Saurian collective faced economic collapse as their manufacturing and resource extraction industries began to fail. The Saurians had built their economy on aggressive business practices and ruthless negotiation tactics that made many other species uncomfortable dealing with them directly. Human diplomats had served as intermediaries who facilitated trade between the Saurians and dozens of species who would not negotiate with the collective on their own. Without human diplomats to smooth over cultural differences and guarantee contract enforcement, these trade partnerships dissolved rapidly. The Saurian reputation for breaking agreements when it suited them and exploiting loopholes in contracts had been offset by human oversight, but now that protection was gone, species that had tolerated Saurian business practices because they trusted human judgment now refused to deal with the collective at all. Factories across Saurian space began closing as orders dried up, and raw materials could not be sold at profitable prices. Unemployment rose to levels not seen in centuries, and civil unrest began brewing in the industrial sectors where workers faced poverty. Councillor Veshkir refused to acknowledge that the economic problems had anything to do with humanity's departure, and he insisted at every council session that galactic market fluctuations were responsible for the collective's difficulties. But the trade data told a very different story that was obvious to anyone willing to examine it honestly. Humanity had represented only a modest percentage of galactic commerce by volume, but they had been the most connected species in the entire network. They had served as bridges between species that would not interact directly, and they had been flexible enough to adapt to the cultural and business practices of dozens of different civilizations. Their removal from the galactic economy had created a cascading failure similar to what the Luminar were experiencing in their power grid. Ambassador Kira watched these disasters unfold with grim satisfaction that came not from seeing others suffer, but from being proven right when she had warned the council this would happen. She proposed during an emergency session that the council should formally apologize to humanity and invite them back as full members with additional rights and privileges to compensate for the insult they had suffered. High Councillor Thexmar rejected this proposal immediately and stated that the council did not apologize to anyone because it would set a dangerous precedent. He argued that if they apologized to humanity, then every minor species would expect similar treatment whenever they disagreed with council decisions. The other senior council members agreed and insisted that maintaining the council's authority was more important than resolving the current crises. Kira pointed out that if they did not change their approach, then the decline would continue, and eventually the council itself might collapse under the weight of accumulated failures. She warned that the next crisis would be even worse than what they were currently experiencing. That next crisis arrived sooner than anyone expected. The Torgan Federation was an aggressive militaristic power that existed outside council space and had been probing the borders for weakness for many years. Intelligence reports now indicated that the Torgans were massing their fleet for a major invasion, and they had chosen their timing perfectly to strike when the council was weakest. Admiral Vrix of the Kalari Union served as the council's defense coordinator, and he reviewed the strategic assessments with increasing alarm. He reported to the council that their defensive grid had 17 critical vulnerabilities, and 12 of those had previously been covered by human patrol routes or human-maintained sensor stations. 3 more vulnerabilities existed in sectors where human tactical advisors had recommended infrastructure improvements that were never implemented because the council had considered human military advice to be primitive and unnecessary. The Torgan invasion fleet entered council space 3 weeks after the intelligence warnings had been issued, and it was larger than anything the Torgans had ever assembled before. 200 warships crossed the border in a coordinated assault that struck simultaneously at multiple points along the defensive perimeter. They attacked exactly where the council's defenses were, weakest in the sectors that humanity had once patrolled with diligence and care. Admiral Vrix commanded the defense from his operations center on Council Station Unity, and he watched the tactical displays with mounting horror as reports came in from every threatened sector. He turned to his aide and stated quietly that the Torgans knew exactly where to strike. His aide was a young Valorian officer named Celthus, who had been reviewing intelligence reports, and he explained that the Torgans must have been observing the border for the past 6 months, watching as the human patrols disappeared, and were never replaced by other council forces. Brix realized immediately what this meant, and his voice was bitter as he stated that the council had handed this opportunity to the Torgans by expelling humanity. The Torgans had been patient and observant, and had waited until the perfect moment to strike when the council was divided and weakened and distracted by internal crises. The first 3 defensive stations fell within hours of the initial assault. The Torgan fleet was using tactics that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied military history. They employed precision strikes against command centers and communication hubs and used rapid movement to avoid prolonged engagements with heavier council ships. These were the same tactics that had proven effective against the Valorians during the Cathtar raids, and they were derived from human military doctrine that had been freely shared during joint exercises. The Council fleet rushed to respond, but they found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. The Torgans had clearly studied the archived records of human tactical demonstrations and had adapted those strategies for their own purposes. The very approaches that the Council had dismissed as primitive and unsuited for advanced warfare were now being used with devastating effectiveness against them. On the 5th day of the invasion, something unexpected happened that brought a moment of shocked silence to the command center. A small human ship entered Council space for the first time in 8 months. It was a diplomatic courier vessel that was completely unarmed and traveling alone. The ship transmitted a single brief message to Council Station Unity stating that humanity was aware of the current situation and would observe the conflict. Admiral Frick stared at the message in disbelief and asked aloud whether the humans were actually going to watch the Council be destroyed without lifting a finger to help. The human ship did not leave after delivering its message, but instead took up position at the edge of the battle zone where it could monitor all communications and scan the tactical situation. With its sophisticated sensors, High Counselor Thexmar had relocated to the military command station for safety as the Torgan advance threatened civilian areas. He sent an urgent personal message directly to the human ship, and his crystalline form pulsed with distress as he composed the words. He admitted that the Council had made a terrible mistake and stated plainly that they had been wrong about humanity. He begged for their help and promised that the Council would do anything to make amends for the insult they had delivered. For the first time in 8 months, a response came from a human source, though it was only transmitted as text without voice or video. The message was short and cold. It stated that the Council had nothing that humanity needed or wanted. Thexmar sent another message immediately, and this time he abandoned all pride and dignity. He told the humans to name their terms for assistance and promised that anything they requested would be granted. He offered full Council membership with senior status and unlimited access to Council technology and favorable trade agreements that would enrich Earth beyond measure. He stated that humanity could have whatever they wanted if they would only help stop the Torgan invasion. The human response came back quickly, and it was even more devastating than the silence had been. The message stated that humanity's terms were not negotiable and would not be acceptable to the Council. The humans would continue to observe but would not intervene. The Torgan advance continued relentlessly, and 12 star systems fell under enemy control within 2 weeks. Millions of civilians were successfully evacuated, but millions more found themselves trapped behind enemy lines facing uncertain fates. The Council fleet fought desperately, but they were losing ground every day. In the Council chamber, panic had completely replaced the arrogance that had once dominated the proceedings. Delegates screamed at each other and assigned blame in every direction except toward themselves. Some species threatened to withdraw from the Council entirely and make separate peace deals with the Torgans. Others demanded that resources be diverted to protect their home systems, even if it meant abandoning other species to their fate. Councillor Veshkir rose to speak, and his scales were flushed dark with rage that seemed to have no outlet. He demanded that the Council authorize the immediate seizure of human technology by military force. He argued that humanity was allowing genocide to occur through their inaction, and that the Council had every moral right to take what they needed to save innocent lives. Ambassador Kira stood abruptly, and her silver fur bristled with barely controlled anger. She asked Veshkir directly if he truly believed that one species acting alone could successfully attack Earth and seize their technology by force. She asked if he honestly thought that humanity had not prepared for exactly that possibility during the 8 months they had been fortifying their defenses. Kira activated a holographic display that showed the current state of Earth's solar system, and the image silenced the entire chamber. Every planet and every moon and every significant asteroid in the system now showed clear signs of orbital defense platforms. The asteroid belt had been reorganized into defensive clusters with overlapping fields of fire. The outer planets hosted what appeared to be massive military shipyards that were producing vessels at an incredible rate. She explained that humanity was not hiding their military buildup, but was instead broadcasting it on open channels for anyone to see. They wanted the galaxy to witness what they had constructed during their isolation. This was deterrence on a scale that made even the most aggressive Council species reconsider any thoughts of hostile action against Earth. Counselor Zeph floated weakly in the center of the chamber, and her energy form flickered with visible distress. She stated that if humanity would not help, then the Council was doomed. The Torgans would sweep through their space and conquer or destroy everything in their path. Kira's voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the chamber as she responded. She said that perhaps the Council deserved this fate. She stated that they had certainly earned it through their arrogance and their cruelty toward a species that had offered only friendship and cooperation. On the 18th day of the invasion, the Torgan fleet made their first significant tactical error. They had become overconfident in their advance and decided to split their forces to attack multiple high-value targets simultaneously. This stretched their supply lines dangerously thin and created vulnerabilities in their communication network that had previously been well protected. Admiral Vrix recognized the opportunity immediately and coordinated a desperate counterattack that managed to isolate and destroy an entire Torgan battle group that had pushed too far ahead of their support elements. It was the first major victory of the war, and it provided a badly needed boost to Council morale. The human observer ship that had been monitoring the battle transmitted a single word in response to this victory. The word was adequate. Then the ship turned and accelerated to faster-than-light speeds and disappeared toward Earth without any further communication. High Counselor Thexmar called an emergency session of the full Council immediately after this incident. He stood before the assembled delegates, and his voice carried none of its usual authority, as he admitted that they could not win this war using conventional tactics. The Torgans had superior intelligence and superior strategy that had been derived from studying human methods. He stated that the Council needed an alternative approach, but he did not know what that approach should be. Ambassador Kira had been waiting for this moment, and she spoke with absolute clarity. She told the Council that they needed the humans and that asking nicely or offering material incentives would never be enough to bring them back. She explained that humanity did not want trade deals or technology, exchanges or even formal apologies, though they certainly deserved all of those things. She pulled up humanity's complete voting record from their 12 years of Council membership and displayed it for everyone to see. She showed the pattern of proposals that humanity had made and how the Council had voted down every single one. She highlighted the policies that humans had supported and how those had been dismissed as naive or impractical. She demonstrated how every innovation humanity had offered was called primitive or unsuitable for advanced civilizations. The Council's counteroffensive collapsed on the 23rd day of the war, and Admiral Vrix sent urgent reports warning that they had perhaps 2 weeks before the defensive lines broke completely. High Counselor Thexmar made a decision that was unprecedented in the 3,000 years of Council history. He called for an immediate vote on completely restructuring the Galactic Council's governing charter and eliminating the power hierarchy that had existed since the Council's founding. The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted and argued, and some even threatened to withdraw their species from the Council entirely. Counselor Veshkir roared that this was complete surrender, and that they were allowing one primitive species to dictate terms to the entire galactic civilization. His scales flushed nearly black with rage as he demanded that the Council maintain its dignity even in defeat. Ambassador Kira stood calmly in the center of the storm, and her voice cut through the noise with simple clarity. She stated that the choice before them was evolution or extinction, and that she personally chose evolution over pride. Several younger species immediately voiced their agreement, and it became clear that the Council was splitting along predictable lines between the ancient powers who wanted to preserve their authority and the newer members who had always resented their subordinate status. The proposed reforms were radical beyond anything the Council had ever considered. Every species would have equal voting rights regardless of how long they had been members or how large their territory was. Leadership positions would rotate among all member species, instead of being permanently held by the senior civilizations. Resource allocation would be determined by need and merit, rather than by political influence. Every major institution would be restructured with transparent democratic processes replacing the old systems of inherited privilege. It was everything that humanity had requested during their 12 years of membership and everything that the council had mocked them for suggesting. The vote was called and the chamber divided almost perfectly down the middle. 23 species voted in favor of the reforms and 23 voted against them. One delegate abstained from voting and held the fate of the entire council in their decision. Councillor Zeph floated in the center of the chamber, and her energy form pulsed with visible anguish as everyone waited for her to speak. She began by stating that she had existed for 800 years and had witnessed the council maintain order and peace and prosperity across 1,000 worlds. She said that she believed deeply in their system and their traditions and everything they had built together over millennia. Then her voice changed and became softer as she continued. She admitted that the council had been wrong about humanity in ways that went far beyond the simple injustice of their expulsion. She explained that humans had not been children playing at civilization, but rather had been a mirror showing the council what they had become over the centuries. She listed the qualities they had lost, including humility and flexibility and willingness to change and openness to new ideas. Zeph turned to face Thexmar directly and announced that she was changing her vote to support the reforms. The final tally appeared on the displays throughout the chamber, showing 24 votes in favor and 23 against. The charter restructuring had passed by the narrowest possible margin. Thexmar immediately composed a message to Earth and included the complete text of the new charter with all its reforms and provisions. The message stated that the Galactic Council had fundamentally reformed itself and was offering humanity full membership under a system of complete equality. It included a formal apology for the treatment humanity had received and acknowledged the errors and arrogance that had led to such injustice. The message specifically stated that they were not begging for military aid, even though they faced destruction. It requested only a chance to prove that the Council had learned from its mistakes and to rebuild the relationship that had been destroyed. 3 days passed with no response from Earth, and during that time, 2 more star systems fell to the Torgan advance. Admiral Vrix prepared evacuation plans for Council Station Unity itself. As the enemy fleet drew closer to the heart of Council space, many delegates privately accepted that this was the end of their civilization and began making arrangements to flee to remote colonies far from the fighting. On the 4th day, a human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the battle zone, and their arrival was detected simultaneously by both Council and Torgan sensors. The fleet consisted of 47 ships, and the number was clearly symbolic and intentional, as it matched the number of species in the Council. These were not the vessels that humanity had possessed during their Council membership, but rather were entirely new designs that had been constructed during the 8 months of isolation. The ships were sleek and elegant, with hull configurations that suggested speed and maneuverability rather than heavy armor. Their weapon systems were compact, but radiated energy signatures that indicated significant power. Their defensive shields flickered with patterns that Council sensors could not fully analyze. Everything about these vessels suggested that humanity had not been idle during their isolation, but had instead revolutionized their entire approach to space warfare. The NE flagship was named Liberty, and it was commanded by Admiral Catherine Blake, who transmitted a message on open channels that both the Council and the Torgans could receive. She identified herself and her fleet, and stated that they were responding to the Council's request for assistance. She made it clear that humanity was not obligated to help, but had chosen to do so because the reformed Council now represented values of equality and cooperation that aligned with Earth's principles. Then she addressed the Torgan Federation directly, and her voice carried cold authority. She stated that the Torgans had observed humanity's departure from Council space and had interpreted it as weakness. She said they had believed that a species which had been insulted and expelled would not defend their former associates. She informed them that they had been catastrophically wrong on both counts. The human fleet accelerated toward the front lines without waiting for Council coordination or joint tactical planning. They simply attacked with precision and overwhelming force. The Torgan fleet, which had dominated the war for 3 weeks, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not predict or counter. The human ships moved in patterns that seemed to violate standard physics and used weapons that exploited vulnerabilities in Torgan defenses that no one had known existed. Most Importantly, the humans fought with an intensity that shocked both the Torgans and the Council observers. Every human vessel engaged as if the survival of Earth itself depended on the outcome of this battle. They took risks that other species would never attempt and suffered casualties. Without any hesitation or retreat, Admiral Fricks watched from his command center as the human fleet carved through the Torgan positions like a blade through silk. He commented quietly to Ambassador Kira that the humans were not merely defending the Council, but were sending a message to the entire galaxy. Kira agreed and explained that humanity was demonstrating that they did not forget anything, whether kindness or insults. The Council had insulted them and expelled them, so humanity had departed in silence. The Torgans had mistaken that departure for weakness and had attacked thinking the humans would not respond. Now humanity was teaching both the Council and the Torgans what happened when human patience was confused with human weakness. The battle continued for 6 days and reinforcements arrived steadily from Earth as more ships completed construction and rushed to join the fight. The human fleet suffered losses, but they never wavered in their assault. Admiral Blake coordinated with Admiral Fricks, and the combined human and Council forces gradually pushed the Torgans back system by system. On the 7th day, the Torgan Federation requested terms for a ceasefire, and their Supreme Commander admitted that they had severely miscalculated the strength and determination of the human species. The terms were harsh but fair, including complete withdrawal from all occupied territory and return of all prisoners and payment of reparations for the damage they had caused. Admiral Blake added one additional term that was not negotiable. She stated that if the Torgan Federation ever threatened Council space again, humanity would consider it a personal insult and would respond with the full might of Earth's military forces. The Torgan commander looked at the human Admiral with something that might have been respect mixed with fear and agreed immediately to all terms. 2 weeks after the ceasefire, the reformed Galactic Council held its first official session under the new charter. The chamber had been physically redesigned so that all delegates sat in a circle with no elevated positions or places of honor. Every species was truly equal in both symbolic and practical terms. Ambassador Daniel Wright returned to represent humanity, and he took his seat among the other delegates without ceremony or special recognition. High Counselor Thexmar, who now held the title of Council Coordinator under the new system, stood to address the assembly. He formally apologized on behalf of the Council for the insult and injury that had been done to humanity.